always been down the rabbit hole of the JFK assassination. But I've actually never took the time to look more into Oswald, which I mean, he has to be some kind of a fascinating man because of all the little quirks and rabbit holes to go down and everything like that. But Larry, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's great to be here.
I am happy to
And
have
I,
you
I took
on.
another look at Oswald myself after working on this for 30 plus years and writing like 3 or 4 books on the assassination. It's like, maybe I should reconsider Oswald. You like he's like right at the middle of this. Maybe I should take another look and not just like believe everything I read about Oswald in all the books.
Oh man, and how'd you get started into it? How'd you get fascinated by this?
Well, it's right. Of course, I grew up with it. I was a sophomore in high school when Kennedy was shot. Remember that quite well. Sunday morning, watch Oswald shot by Ruby on TV, so that sticks with you. But then, you know, college, Air Force, life in general, got in, and then, but in about, I think it was about 95, my wife came in and said, I just read that a reporter in Dallas has published a book on the Kennedy assassination, and maybe you'd be interested. And I said, well, sure, I'll read it. And I read it, and that was it. Uh, you know, 30 years plus later, that's all it took. It's like one book and I'm done. It goes on forever.
Oh, that is outstanding. How long did it take you to compile all the information in the Oswald paradox?
Well, the strange thing is, I went down so many leads and so many roads. I mean, there are so many people that have posed, as different motives and different scenarios and that sort of thing. I got caught up in those for many, many years. Uh, but it all kind of gave background work on Oswald. But as I just said, it's like at that point in time, I was just taking everything in. And so if somebody that seemed like a reputable source wrote something about Oswald, I assume they knew what they were talking about. It took me about 20 years plus to get to the point of going, wait a minute, no, you need to go back to the original source material yourself. You need to revisit this. And so actually, I've done 3 books on the assassination, but about 2 years ago, I decided I'd finally written a book called Tipping Point, which was my take on the conspiracy. This is where it started. This is how it came about. These are the people that went to Dallas. And it's kind of like, okay, I'm done. All right, I finally satisfied myself on the conspiracy. No, it wasn't Oswald. And then it was like, what about Oswald? Wait a minute, you forgot him. He's not even in the book. Okay. And so for about 2 years, David Boylan, my co-author, and I went back to Oswald, back to other sources, back to friends, people that had befriended him in Russia as well as United States and the Marine Corps, kind of like a totally revisit to Oswald and see where it takes us. Let's not have any preconceptions. Let's just go look at Oswald as a person. And so that's been the last couple of years looking at it as a person and working a lot of the issues that have come up. People made assumptions about Oswald, took positions on Oswald. You know, how do we assess that if we're looking at it with fresh eyes?
That is actually really intriguing. So, what are some of the things that surprised you when you got further in depth with Oswald?
I I think one of the things that surprised me he's often pictured, well, he's pictured by the Warren Commission as being antisocial, asocial, violent, you know, disassociated from society, out of touch, that kind of loner, lone nut. You got to have him be that kind of person if he's going to be a lone nut. And one of the
Mhm.
reasons they did that, it becomes very clear, is that they couldn't find any motive for him to kill JFK or not even to dislike him. People they interviewed said, yeah, he thought the Kennedy administration was doing the right thing in pretty much everywhere except in regard to Cuba. Uh, he really thought Kennedy was the right person to talk uh, about détente with Khrushchev and maybe prevent a war. He was very much in tune with racial justice and Kennedy's policies on integration. So, he spoke positively about Kennedy, actually mapping Kennedy's, global view is pretty close fit to Oswald in terms of easing Cold War tensions, and maybe we can talk to these people. So that was a pop problem for them. So they reverted to kind of cherry picking to make him the lone nut. And
Okay.
one of the things we do in the book is we went to the trouble of pulling actually a photo collection that kind of shows the real Oswald, joking around in school, joking with kids and girls in the hallway in Russia. He's on has lots of friends in Russia. He's on the beach with girls in bikinis. This is not the Oswald you see in the Warren Commission. If Life magazine had put these pictures on the front page rather than Oswald with a rifle, it might have been harder to sell the image that was sold of Oswald. But the other thing we also saw is there are two or three, and what we're looking for is constants. What's the
Hmm.
constant in his personality? What's the continuity in his character? What can you always say? You can always say, and we found there were some real constants. For one thing, Oswald was actually far more intelligent than you get a sense of in reading either the Warren Commission or a lot of conspiracy literature. Uh, he got to the point, he tested at 118 in school, which is pretty good IQ test in
Hmm.
school. Um, when he went into the Marines, he tested and got into a technical career field as a radar technician operator. Uh, not just infantry, but a technical career field. Um, when he was in the Marines, his officers would go on record to say he read a lot. Oswald was on the transport going from the U.S. to Japan. He was reading Leaves of Grass by Whitman. This is not your normal Marine,
No,
literature.
I was in the Marines. I know it's
Yeah,
not.
uh, you probably weren't reading. I was not reading that when I was in the Air
I
Force
was not
either. But
reading any Whitman.
uh,
Not
you
at
know,
all.
but he read politics. He read history. He in Japan in the Marines, one of his officers testified that they would get into political discussions, and Oswald could hold his own or better talking geopolitics, social systems.
Hmm.
This Marine officer was a graduate of an Ivy League university in political science. Okay,
Yeah.
this is a pretty big admission for a Marine officer to make, that this guy with one stripe and like he's talking at my level. Oswald was extremely literate. When he came back to the US after Russia and did interviews, job interviews and placement interviews, he tested well, he interviewed well. We have records showing that the placement people uh, really thought he should go into management level jobs.
Hmm.
But he always needed a job so badly and money so badly that they had to put him into the first job that came along, which is pretty much always manual labor.
Oh yeah.
Um, so I think those are two fine. He doesn't have the character. He has more intelligence than you expect. He's not at all antisocial or asocial. I mean, at the time of his death, he was married and had two children. Had dated extensively in Japan and Russia. Uh, Proposed twice in Russia. This is not a loner. You had to really sway the facts to make him a loner. But the thing is, if he liked you and you caught kind of like, if you didn't put him down, he had good friends and had, but if you, it's kind of like, I remember this from the 60s, there are these people who were pains. If you didn't agree totally with their politics, they were just a pain. One of my Marine buddies said, "Oh yeah, there was one in every barracks, you know, and yeah, they'd get into arguments, or they just read, whatever." Um, so there was that. I think the other thing that was constant is Oswald was always his own person. He wanted to see things for himself. That's why he got into the Marines. He wanted adventure. He wanted to
Mhm.
travel. He wanted to write. And actually, by 1963, he was writing a lot, which nobody ever reads. But they put it in the Warren Commission in the appendices, right? In the 26 volumes, you have Oswald's monograph on geopolitics, why Russian communism is bad, what was, compromised between the capitalist system and the socialist system. He writes, he reads and he writes. And so he's, but he wants to do it himself. He doesn't take orders well. I think that's something, if you were in the Marines, we can appreciate, when you throw a drink on your NCO in the club, that's not a good sign. Uh, you know, he in school, he wasn't, when he had gone from New Orleans to New York City, which is a tough move for any Southern
Yeah.
city,
Yeah.
um, people laughed at his clothes, they laughed at his accent, of course, but he didn't get into fights. He just became a truant. But when the
Mhm.
truant officer said, "Okay, you've got two choices. You've got to go. You're either going into a home or you're going back to school," it's like back to school. And the next semester he gets an A on social relationships. You're like, okay, he understands the system, but he doesn't take orders well. In the Marines, he gets kicked off the football team because he wants to be calling the plays. Okay, this is Oswald. So as you said, he really was quite a unique individual for the late 50s, early 60s.
Mhm.
I grew up in that time and place, and he would have stood out as a character, but he's the kind of character that you thought was you kind of respected and kind of thought was a pain in the rear, both at the
I
same
can see
time.
that. Do we know what got Oswald into so in depth with politics?
Yeah, he said himself his mother like moved the family like six different times over 5, 6 years. He was always in different schools, so he's was at home a lot, on his own a lot, did a lot of reading. He was a reader. He was a reader more than a talker. So he did a lot of reading at different publications, and he was very upset by the fact that his mother always was getting low paid menial jobs. And so he kind of got to think, there's a class system in place here. I don't like
Hmm.
this. Mother can never, we're not, never have a stable family. We're always moving. Um, and and so that started tending him towards what you would call economic justice thinking. I guess you would say it's kind of like the system is not fair. And so he
Hmm.
starts doing a lot of reading and basically gets into a mindset where it gets very inclined towards socialism. Everybody in his own writing, he says, "Look, I believe in capitalism. There, no, don't believe in communism, but there should be health care for all. There should be work and job training for all. That you should be able to get help trained to get a good job or go
Hmm.
to college or whatever." So that's kind of his mindset. As a teenager, he actually wrote the Young Socialist Federation in the US, wanting to join. And with Oswald, it's kind of like, I want to join the Young Socialist Federation. And is there a club around here that I can join? Okay, not your asocial guy. And if there's not a club, can I start one? Okay, again, not an asocial guy. So
Yeah.
I think it started in his teen years. And if you look in his reading, and we know what he was reading because they got his library card, they've got his reading
Hmm.
list, and he's reading that sort of literature even when he goes into the Marines. But what really I think turned it, and he himself, he was asked this, it's like, so why did you become so interested in Russia? He said, well, when I was in Japan, I was, and he doesn't say this, but we know what he was doing. He was hitting the bars
Oh
because
yeah.
Japan was very, up until that time, Oswald had not even like dated and in his first year in Japan, okay, his buddies introduced him to the bars. They introduced him to the bar girls. It's a whole different world in Japan. And he kind of, for a while at least, he becomes more like your normal Marine in Japan, okay,
Oh
fine.
yeah.
He's meeting lots of young people in the bars, and they're
Hmm.
talking about what's going on in Japan. He said, Japan was moving towards a very strange place between, an imperial system and, democracy, and they're socialist and they're communist, and they're talking to them, and no doubt some of them were, I don't think there's any doubt at all, were at the bars because they wanted to spread their way of thinking. Um, And so he became intrigued by what they were saying. And most of them were looking towards Russia. I mean, Japan, Russia, the influence is very great
Yeah.
there. And he just became, it's like, well, I wonder, I was interested in socialism. I wonder how the Russians are doing it. I wonder how they're doing their communism. Because Oswald, socialism, Marxism, and communism at that point were like all three words could mean anything.
Yeah.
But so he
Definitely.
became very interested in going to Russia, started studying Russia, Russian, self-teaching Russia, even. And after he got busted a couple of times, one time for having a pistol and shooting himself in the leg, okay, not a good thing. The second for throwing a drink on his NCO, not a good thing. He kind of became disenchanted with the Corps, right? All right. They took away one stripe. They're not giving me my corporal stripe. They didn't let me extend my tour in Japan. All right, what am I going to do next? So he really gets into studying Russia. He looks to enroll in college in Switzerland, actually. And if you look at his application, he wants to study politics and philosophy and that kind of a liberal education. But he even took as we know, you can get extra credit if you speak a language, right? So he actually
Hmm.
took a Russian test in the Marines, and we have his scores. And he couldn't speak it very well, which makes sense. He had nobody to talk to. He could read it moderately well because he was self-teaching himself. So I think that's my usual long-winded answer to any question is that's where and how he became interested in Russia and Russian.
No, that's all right. And what did he take away from Russia? Because you had mentioned earlier that he didn't really like Russian communism. So I'm curious, like when he leaves and comes back,
Yeah.
what would make him say that when he was so
Yeah.
moved to go there?
Well, aside from a new wife and baby, he took
Hmm.
away a strong dislike for the Russian, and he writes about this in detail. He actually wrote a manuscript about his time in Russia and what he liked and what he didn't like. He felt it was totally bureaucratic. The party, the party, Communist Party was more like a bureaucratic system that it wasn't what they believed. It was like the system they put in place. Had to attend meetings, you had to do this, you had to do that. And Oswald didn't like taking orders, so clearly he didn't like that. Oswald is
Hmm.
maybe the only person, certainly the only American, actually to stage a strike in a Russian factory. His friend Ernst Titovitz, who wrote about this extensively, said Oswald just decided he didn't like going to all those meetings. And he writes about the meetings were boring. Nobody was paying attention except the party officers who were watching to see who wasn't watching. It's like this is classic Oswald. He knows what's going on. He hated the bureaucracy and he actually staged like a work stop. But his boss in the factory, who was a good friend of his, was going like, no, no, Lee, we do not do this in a Russian factory. You don't understand. I'm losing my. And so he stopped. But he wrote he didn't like the
Okay.
strictures. And he thought, quite frankly, and this is again kind of interesting for his time and place, that most of the party officials were just taking advantage of the party and the perks of the party. They could take vacations, they could go to the coast, the workers couldn't. They had it's like
Yeah.
it's just another system under another name. And he actually wrote that he felt that that Soviet communism was actually a facade for Russian nationalism,
Hmm.
and that the communist parties they were putting overseas were just tools of Russian nationalist geopolitics, which is extremely insightful and probably brighter than most people in 1960. I will
Oh,
say that.
absolutely.
Um, so yeah, he did not like the system. He still retained. He actually wrote in the spring of 1963 a paper that said, "Look, here would be the best combination of Russian socialism. We need to have education for all, we need to have healthcare for all, but here's what we need to take from capitalism." So he was actually thinking about how you could meld the two together. And a lot of his reading during the winter spring of 63 was about Cuba And he
Hmm.
actually came to believe that maybe Cuba was doing it right, or certainly doing it better than Russia had, kind of like, and if you read Cuban literature, no racism, everybody gets health care, it was touted. And he was reading the publications like the Socialist Workers' Party newspaper, which were touting actually no longer touting the Russian Revolution, but touting the Cuban Revolution. And he was getting his head into, and actually got his head into, you know, I need to go see how Cuba is. Maybe Cuba is getting it right. As early as the Marines, he had talked with a Marine buddy named Delgado about them both, when their term was over, they should go to Cuba, they should join the Cuban regime, uh, basically fight against Yankee imperialism in
Oh yeah.
Central America, that sort of thing. So that wasn't totally new for Oswald. And he had been meeting with Cubans in Russia, who were studying there. So not a total, but that was a very much of a shift in his thinking. Like, I still believe the things I believe, but I wonder if anybody can get it right. And
Yeah.
in his conversation with his best friend at the time in Dallas, his his friend asked him about that, and Oswald goes, I probably won't ever find what I'm looking for, but I'm going to keep looking.
So in a way, he was kind of seeking out that validation for his train of thought of how things should be run and seeing if it, in some social standpoint or country, if it actually worked.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Uh,
No, it makes sense. That makes sense. So what got him, I don't want to say mad or angry, let's say involved. What got him involved with Kennedy?
well, the
And I
strange
mean,
thing,
I know you mentioned Cuba, obviously, and
yeah,
everything going on there, but there had to have been more than that.
nothing actually got him involved in Kennedy. What he
Okay.
got involved with was, and actually he was asked this question on the air on radio in New Orleans, and he was asked if he didn't like Kennedy, you know, and Oswald said essentially, no, it's not about Kennedy, it's the administration policy towards Cuba. I
Okay.
don't like that, they're they have an embargo, they're acting against Cuba, we need to change that. So basically, it wasn't JFK per se, it was, the US needs to treat Cuba better. There's no reason it should be treating Cuba like it is. Cuba's not doing anything, which is why he committed to the Fair Play for Cuba committee. That's it, literally it. So his interest, what really happened is his interest in Cuba got him in New Orleans entangled with both anti-Castro Cubans and people presenting themselves as pro-Castro Cubans who were really anti, who wanted to figure out which side he was on. It's kind of like they're trying to feel him out. Is he really anti-Castro? We're not sure. We need to test him. And at the same time, interestingly enough, the very first person he went to in the Cuban community in New Orleans, which is something we only realized maybe 2 years ago, max, was the brother of a senior CIA propaganda political action officer at JM Wave in Miami, who had come out of Cuba, had been working covertly in Cuba, and in 1963 was involved with counterintelligence propaganda. Anyway, so he immediately, just by making contact with this guy's brother and making contact with the anti-Castro Cuban directorate, who are working for the CIA case officers, again, Oswald put him, like, just threw himself in the middle of a spider web, connecting him to CIA Cuba project activities. Uh, and by August, which I find amazing, again, we've only known fairly recently, by August of 1963, he was already being used in anti-Castro propaganda. Letters were being written to congressmen about, how easily Americans could be subverted. Here's this well-intentioned US ex-Marine. He's been corrupted by Cuban propaganda. Uh, they're writing letters, they're warning people about him. And we think we've identified at least two, if not three, different CIA operations that were coming into play using Oswald's image, but not using Oswald himself. So unwittingly using it because he had been on radio and TV and in newspapers in New Orleans with his Cuban agenda, which is exactly what you want for deniable propaganda operations. You
Oh
want
yeah.
somebody that's going the direction you want to go, and you just shift stuff around them.
Oh, absolutely. What was some of his immediate family and friends' thoughts about him going down that road with Cuba or even moving to Russia for that matter?
Well, Marina and Oswald, by
Mhm.
by that by spring, they had one child, and Marina was pregnant again. And at the beginning of 1963, it was pretty obvious that life in the US was not working out for Marina the way she'd expected. She even wrote, the Oswald who proposed to me in Russia was romantic. He had his own apartment. He had a lot of money. We were doing well in Russia. And now we're in the US where it's kind of like, without saying it, I expected there would be cars and refrigerators and appliances. And no, they're not. He has all these menial jobs. He keeps losing his job. He gets bored. He can't keep it. We're separated. They were separated frequently over a year or so. She was living with other people. In January of 63, she started applying to go back to Russia. And he was endorsing her, possibly him, but at least her going back to Russia because she was a Russian citizen.
Mhm.
And so the question is how she was taking it. Well, according to Marina herself, basically Oswald said, "My desire is to get to Cuba. How whatever it takes." He even talked about hijacking an aircraft, which was getting to be a thing at that time. And, well, would you help me if I get a pistol? And Marina said, I told him he was out of his mind. If he wants to go to Cuba and he gets to Cuba and he wants me and the kids to come, she's pregnant again by that time.
Mhm.
I told him I would come, but it's on him. I don't want to be part of any of that nonsense. I think it's stupid. Marina had no problems telling Oswald when she thought he was doing something stupid. Uh,
Good.
that's pretty clear.
About like any wife, it sounds like,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and generally, probably her judgment calls were better than his.
More than likely.
On Thursday, November the 21st, basically, we in the book we write what we think is a solid biography and character study of Oswald for about 2/3 of the book, and then in the last 2/3 of the book, it is speculative. This is the scenario of
Mhm.
what we think Oswald got into, how people manipulated him, how they set him up, so on and so forth. But we think that on the 21st, he really had a choice. Some people had offered him a way to get to Cuba, which is what he wanted to do. Marina had a new baby. She was living with someone that's taking care of her, the pains, the Ruth pain. And we know, according to her, he said basically, he came back and he said, I want us to move together as a family immediately. I want to get an apartment tomorrow. I want you to commit to move in with me. I want to have the family together. And Marina essentially said, look, I got a brand new baby. Diapers, you ever hear diapers? This lady here has a washing machine. Once we get it 2 or 3 months down the road, and once you show me an apartment with a washing machine in it, we'll talk. I mean, I hate to be that blunt, but sometimes life is
Yeah.
like that. And so Marina said she later regretted, being kind of like rejecting his overture. But our assessment is he was on the cusp. He had an offer to go to Cuba. If she had said, oh, he's torn, new baby, family, which way are you going to go? Um, and when she declined his offer, we feel that on November 22nd, he was going to take the offer to go to Cuba and actually get on a plane that would essentially be hijacked to Cuba.
Hmm.
Had nothing to do with JFK, nothing to do with the assassination, other than he was probably told it'll be easier to do this when everybody is looking at the president being in town.
Yeah. Yeah, it's totally understandable. What is if anything else, I know we are running a little bit low on time here. If anything else, what do you hope that readers will take away from this book?
I think really what I would hope to is that the Oswald that everybody has in their mind, and even the Oswald that either the Warren Commission or the conspiracy community, which I've been part of for decades now,
Oh,
okay,
absolutely. Me
is
too.
not the Oswald. We really need to give Oswald his due and address the complexity of his character, the issues with his character, what got him into trouble. He's a bit of a drama queen. I mean,
Hmm.
there's no doubt about that. He wasn't violent, but he could be dramatic in his activities, kind of like we get back to somebody who throws a drink in the NCO's face is a bit of a drama queen,
A little
and then
bit.
invites the NCO outside into the alley when he's outweighed probably by 40 pounds. Bit of a drama queen. Um, they need to Oswald needs to be given his due as a real person, which he hasn't been. He's not that way in the textbooks. He's not that way in the Warren Commission or in most of the conspiracy books. So, number one would be, in fairness, you need to look at the original sources, people that knew Oswald, people that knew him in the Marines and Russia, high school, and get the real Oswald. And then you need to step back and say, well, if that's the real Oswald, did he really kill the president? And ask yourself that question. And
Hmm.
when you see it doesn't look like he did, it's like, well, in that case, how was it so easy to convict him? And what you see is there's really, when push comes to shove, there was only one piece of evidence that convicted Lee Harvey Oswald. And that was a rifle traceable to Oswald that was found in the school book depository. Interestingly enough, Oswald's in custody for 48 hours, almost 2 days. Uh, Nobody ever showed him that rifle and said, is this yours? Nobody ever
Hmm.
showed him the sack that was supposedly used to carry it into the school book depository and said, is this yours? And if you say this is yours, you know, so it won't have your fingerprints on it, right? So nobody ever gave him the opportunity to defend himself. And that's one of the things that becomes very clear is um, up to the time of his death, he had no idea how much trouble he was in. He was talking to his wife about buying new shoes for the baby. This is his concern. You've been charge killing, and this he was not concerned. He was only beginning to realize how deeply he was into it. And so I'd like people to look at his behavior during that 48 hours. And again, compare that to what supposedly he did. And if you look at that and say, oh, that none of that fits, then we need to address who and how Oswald was framed. Who and how
Hmm.
Oswald was framed at the time of the assassination, and why did that lead to an immediate characterization of Oswald as the only one involved? I mean, what we
Hmm.
find is if you look after the fact, you find calls from the president's political aide to Dallas that night saying there will be no charges of conspiracy. And in Dallas, you find the DA tearing up a charge that said conspiracy in the assassination of the president. Why would the president have this guy on the phone calling the head of the law enforcement in Dallas, the Texas Attorney General, saying there will be no charges or investigation of conspiracy? Why do you find within 48 hours of the assassination of the president, J. Edgar Hoover telling his chief aides to write a report on Oswald as the lone assassin? And when they push back and say, well, boss, that's going to be hard to do because we haven't really done an investigation yet, the
Hmm.
response is, I don't care about it. I want the report on my desk in like 4 days, okay, and make it look good. Uh, why would that happen? So it needs to raise some questions, higher level questions that need to be asked about how could this have happened to Oswald? How does it happen? So, in any event, it looks like I might have to get off shortly.
Absolutely.
just,
No,
just heard the phone ring.
nope. You are totally fine, Larry. I appreciate you so much coming on the podcast and talking about the Oswald paradox. And for my listeners, you can check the links in the description. You can go and click on those and go check out his other books and this one for purchase. And thank you again for joining me. I
I
appreciate you.
appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Absolutely. I agree.
Have a good
Thank you so
weekend.
much. You too. Stay warm.
I'm going to try.
Me too.